We have an esteemed group, and I am especially honored to welcome this morning Dr. Simone Gold, who has national and international attention. She has been a prolific writer. She has been a tireless warrior for freedom of speech, for patient-centered, physician-guided medical care, and continues to be a huge figure in the public discourse arena. So I encourage everyone to read her impressive bio and credentials, and without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Simone Gold.
Thank you. Thank you for the very warm welcome. It is truly, for me, a pleasure to speak at AAPS. I will circle back at the end to tell you a bit of a personal story about why AAPS is so specifically meaningful to me specifically. I got that backwards. Okay. As our previous speaker was talking about, the freedom to speak, the freedom to act freely, right, is in tremendous jeopardy, but we're going to try to stay focused on the medical today because that's the lane that we can do the most good. I think that AAPS is the most important physician organization in America. This is not hyperbole. I've traveled the nation for 4 years. I've spoken to innumerable people and organizations. If we are to have a medical system that prioritizes the doctor-patient relationship, it must, as opposed to a medical system that exists as a mere government branch enforcing the government's will, the solutions will need to come from doctors who can think independently, may I say even creatively. The medical industrial complex has become a complex web of institutional stakeholders with multi-billion-dollar financial interests. It's replete with lawyers, accountants, compliance officers, and government doctors who have become the data entry clerks for all of these other institutions. The corruption is so universal that I personally believe that every federal institution has been corrupted, most state institutions, most corporations, virtually every academic center, and all healthcare institutions that take government money, which is virtually 100% of them. We'll hear about one that doesn't today. In addition to all of us witnessing the corruption of most corporations, such as big businesses and big brands who have gone woke and used DEI instead of meritocracy, and the corruption of most educational systems, over the past 4.5 years, I have been personally targeted by many institutions, including the federal and state legislative, executive, and judicial branches, legacy and social media, healthcare corporations, a state bar association, a state medical board, and various NGOs. I use myself as an example to show the limits of what can happen to a person. So you'll be a little bit amused and entertained by these stories. This type of targeting could not have happened if the infrastructure within a particular institution had not already been corrupted. Corrupt results, like we saw during COVID, required a pre-existing corrupted infrastructure. To those of us in this room, some corruption is more painful than others. Everyone in this room has spent a decade or more in academic settings. Everyone in this room has spent a decade or more in healthcare institutions. And in my case, I also spent many years in the legal institutions, mostly not behind bars, but there's that. So for doctors, the corruption of academia and the healthcare institutions as hospitals and insurance companies is especially painful. All of this corruption starts with censorship. There are stages to censorship. And for Americans who think of censorship in historical terms, like communist or fascist governments, I think most of us are underestimating the severity of the censorship that we are already enduring. I'm not positive if I know how to do this. Thank you. There are 7 stages of censorship. There's self-censorship, there's informal, there's institutional, government regulation, government enforced, complete censorship, and finally, full propaganda. We all have some experience with this, and I'll give examples as we continue. But in an era of instant worldwide communication, controlled by a handful of monopolistic corporations receiving enormous federal kickbacks from the federal government, achieving worldwide, near-complete censorship is now possible. That is new. We all know the bias of omission. Most of us have had our content oppressed on social media. Probably this room is at a 50% suppression rate. That's remarkable. How relevant, how important is the subject of censorship for doctors? I think we all dreamily thought that censorship did not affect our industry as much as other industries. Actually, my observation the last several years, I think it's worse in the healthcare space. It's worse because doctors are highly rewarded for being very conformist. Compared to average, we are more obedient and better rule followers. In exchange for our remarkable ability to delay gratification and our compliant behavior, historically doctors were socially and financially rewarded. Our system is biased towards accepting people who are in the aggregate more compliant, more risk-averse, and then turns those people into high-status people with the most to lose. Due to these personality traits, as a group, we permitted every aspect of our professional lives to become hyper-regulated, which is another way of saying we allowed ourselves to be completely controlled. Looking back on my training, I now recognize that by the 1990s, the soft censorship level 3, the soft censorship of institutional censorship, or sometimes called corporate gatekeeping, was completely embedded throughout residency training. And for example, in Journal Club each week, a time when residents are supposed to learn about statistics and epidemiology and the correct ways to analyze research, the content of the medical article was completely biased. I now recognize this as soft censorship. Some subjects were okay and some were not. Our star resident was notable precisely because he understood exactly how the game was played. He would write and publish, respectfully, the stupidest pieces of research, quote-unquote research, and he was highly rewarded for it. He was not coincidentally, not a great bedside doctor. He was very stiff with patients. He was not warm at all. He would never touch a patient. And when I mean never, never. We once had a fourth-year medical student on rounds with us who fainted, and they put her in a gurney, and he gloved up before he would touch her. I mean, he was just talking with her a moment before, and back in the 90s, the glove use was not quite so ubiquitous. So it's weird how he was the standard bearer. We never questioned it. Later during COVID, because I was curious, I looked up his COVID track record, and it was exactly as you would expect, unquestioned obedience to authority. This was, of course, our star resident. Whereas the most maverick resident among us, which by the way was not me, it's funny, I was quite mainstream until a few years ago, he ended up kind of quietly, modestly in our lane. He had a little bit of protest put out there on social media, and I was not surprised when I look back on these two examples. These are not coincidences. This is how the system rewards people in our lane. It's even worse now. Some of you have probably heard Dr. Rennie Moon talking about the time she was a senior attending on rounds, and medical students complained that they felt unsafe with her medical teaching comments. And the senior attending, Dr. Moon, was reprimanded. It is not an overstatement to say this is totally unimaginable as recently as 15 or even 10 years ago. This is not a typical case of senior doctors bemoaning the work ethic of junior doctors. We all know that time-honored practice. No, it is incompatible with learning to be a good doctor if a senior rounding teaching attendant has to be on guard that a junior resident internal medical student is going to complain of being unsafe on rounds due to conversations on rounds. There's no possibility of effective teaching, no possibility of not engaging in self-censorship. So much of medicine, by definition, relates to social issues. The only way a doctor can avoid being punished in such a system is to engage in rampant self-censorship. So things have clearly gotten worse, even since I was a resident in the 90s. Most of us have experienced these first three stages of self-censorship, social or informal censorship, and then the soft censorship of institutional or corporate gatekeeping. I've had the more unpleasant experience of moving on to the fourth and fifth stage of censorship, which is government regulation and legal censorship, and government-enforced censorship, which is hard censorship. It's important to share this so you can recognize what degree this amount of censorship is already embedded in our institutional infrastructure within healthcare. Stage 4, which is government regulation and legal censorship, is when a government starts passing regulations and laws that actually restrict speech. The government never calls it censorship. No. The names of these laws always imply that they are helpful to society, good for national security or general safety. It's called banning hate speech. Never mind that as a lawyer, I'm telling you, there is no category of speech known as hate speech. The Supreme Court has looked at the issue of free speech many times since our country was founded. There is a few very narrow exceptions to free speech. You're not allowed to cause clear and present danger to someone. You can't say, oh, there's Chuck Schumer over there, I think I'll go kill him. You couldn't even say it if it was Pelosi, for example. So there's protection, for example, against child pornography, and there's certain zoned areas where you can't do certain things. Some of you may remember, you used to be accosted in the airport if proselytizers of different religions would come up and talk to you. So to get around the problem that everyone has free speech, the Supreme Court held they could have free speech, but only in this certain geographic area. So we have a very robust Supreme Court precedent about free speech. There is no category of hate speech, none. That's a fiction of the media or the leftist activists. What is hateful to one person is likely not universal. And the insurmountable problem is, who gets to decide what is hateful? Hint, it's not you. America is barely holding on against the rising tide of outlawing hate speech sweeping Western nations. The battle is lost in Canada, where professionals can now be punished for not using another person's preferred pronouns. Never before had a free person been mandated to use particular words. Mandating particular words, such as pronouns, is a sea change in how we internalize our human sense of freedom. It's not trivial, it's enormous. Western nations had never permitted requiring certain type of speech in the past. In the United Kingdom, the laws leading to outright censorship started in the 1980s. There are multiple acts. They did the Public Order Act of 1986, Malicious Communications Act of 1988. Notice the words, right? The public order, malicious communication. Then the Communications Act of 2003 and the Terrorism Act of 2006. Then they came up with the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Act of 2022. These all include hate speech, and if you're in violation, you of course can be charged. An American example of the stage 4 censorship is our federal executive branch agencies. Many of you might have followed the Missouri v. Biden or Murphy v. Missouri case, which was heard by the Supreme Court this term. America's Frontline Doctors and AAPS both filed amicus briefs in support of the 2 state attorney generals who found overwhelming factual evidence of government censorship. Overwhelming. This case is worth reading. It's mind-blowing. There were weekly emails, phone calls, and meetings from multiple federal agencies to all of the social media companies. This was particularly relevant to doctors because the censorship started, the reason for it was for medical issues, but it very quickly spread within months. The biggest targets of social media censorship were doctors and independent health reporters. Health Freedom LA, OAN, Breitbart News, Alex Berenson, Tucker Carlson, Fox News, Candace Owens, The Daily Wire, Bobby Kennedy Jr., myself, America's Frontline Doctors, and Dr. Joseph Mercola were named as the people most censored. This is not surprising because tyranny very often starts with the medical. After all, it was the Committee of Public Safety which brought a dictatorship to the French people during the French Revolution. In 2021, our government brought us the following, well documented in Missouri v. Biden. The government required the social media companies to submit periodic COVID-19 reports, the product changes, how they change the algorithms to avoid misinformation, meaning how to stop you from sending something out that would go viral. So they built algorithms for that. They built in frictions, called frictions in the IT world, to reduce sharing and early detection of misinformation. So that one was very interesting for me because if you remember the summer of 2020 when America's Frontline Doctors stood on the steps of the Supreme Court, we hit 20 million views in 8 hours, which to this day I think is the most viral video of all time for that amount of speed. And then at 8 hours, we were deplatformed by all social media. So they had mechanisms in place that allowed a video to be shared until they all kind of obviously talked to each other because they all went down at exactly the same time. That took 8 hours. If it had gone on, if the video had been seen by the next morning, it would have been hit 100 million. But we were at 20 million, 8 hours. Now they have these frictions and these constant meetings. They can detect a video going, quote, viral in about 30 minutes, an hour, very, very fast. The government started pre-rollout calls with all of the social media companies. So if the social media company was coming up with a new feature, they had to do a pre-rollout meeting, phone call or email with the government. This is outsourcing censorship, which is flat out illegal under the First Amendment. If the government can't do it itself, which it can't then have somebody else do its dirty work, and that's what it's doing, and there's a tremendous paper trail written in Missouri v. Biden. The government argued with Twitter and Facebook about Twitter and Facebook's own policies. The government threatened financial loss if the companies did not comply with censorship, and of course the companies rolled over. They complied. There were multiple emails, phone calls, in-person meetings. The social media companies would flag, put warning labels, and reduce the reaches of posts, pages, groups, accounts. One of our good friends, I don't think she's here today, but Dr. Lynn Finn, I think she ended up with 8 different accounts, right? We all ended up following her in different places. I don't know how she managed to do that because most people I knew couldn't figure it out because they would even check your computer. But it was very difficult. It was very difficult. Specifically, the government request first started demands. They would say, you have to take this down. And then if they didn't, they were threatened. They were threatened specifically from the White House, from the NIH, from the CDC, the Census Bureau, the Surgeon General, HHS, the FBI, to Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, WhatsApp, Instagram, LinkedIn, Reddit, Spotify, Microsoft, and others. There's absolute proof. You can read the emails yourself. It's all well documented. The agency started by asking to censor COVID-19. Specifically, they were very upset in the beginning about the lab leak theory, you know, that conspiracy theory, right? They were very upset about hydroxychloroquine. That was the lane they got most upset with me about. Lockdowns, the Great Barrington Declaration was a very, very upsetting for them. Ivermectin, masks, and they were very upset with Alex Berenson. But they rapidly escalated within a very short time, I think it was about 3 or 4 months, to start censoring other subjects. This is right, this is what happens. If you get too little resistance to something, it just spreads. Climate change, within about 3 months, gender discussions, abortion, economic policy, election issues, and Hunter Biden. And my personal favorite of how we're not turning into North Korea, or are we, was they were very upset. There was a silly little parody video on Jill Biden, and there was communication from the White House to YouTube to take it down. I mean, it was just not even anything. There you go. That reminded me of North Korea. The Missouri and Louisiana's attorneys general found overwhelming evidence of government censorship. For example, the United States Surgeon General told the group, "We are asking technology companies to operate with greater transparency and accountability so that misinformation does not continue to poison our sharing platforms, and the government has an important role too." These are very chilling words. The Surgeon General of the United States is saying we have to stop free speech. The trial judge, who is the person closest to the evidence, said the following at the beginning of his 155-page opinion upholding the attorneys general. Quote, "If the allegations made by the plaintiffs are true, the present case involves the most massive attack against free speech in United States history. In their attempts to suppress alleged disinformation, the federal government, and particularly the defendants named here, are alleged to have blatantly ignored the First Amendment's right to free speech." He quotes our founding fathers, who said, "For if men are to be precluded from offering their sentiments on a matter, reason is of no use to us. The freedom of speech may be taken away, and dumb and silent we may be led, like sheep to the slaughter. Whoever would overthrow the liberty of a nation must begin by subduing the free acts of speech." That was the judge's finding after reading the evidence in Missouri v. Biden. Again, well worth your time. It is abundantly clear that our federal government engaged in massive censorship. I'll just give one small example. On page 65 of this opinion, the FBI emailed 7 social media companies. This is the FBI agent from San Francisco. They put 6 FBI agents in the San Francisco area on censoring misinformation due to COVID. This is what our FBI was doing. The FBI agent testified that he emailed 7 social media companies, one each, 1 to 6 times per month. Each email would flag dozens of indicators, and the FBI would request that the companies report on their actions. So the FBI would say, we don't like this, we don't like this, we don't like this, and we don't like this. Tell me what you're doing about it. More than 8 FBI agents were dedicated to censorship, not 6. The dates, names, locations, demands, threats, and policy changes, all in the opinion. In June, so this case finally went up all the way to the Supreme Court, and in June, the Supreme Court returned the case to the lower court. Instead of giving us a win, didn't give a loss, but didn't give a win, sent it back to the lower court to determine if the plaintiffs had standing. You may remember the standing issue from the 2020 election. It's a duck. It was not a loss on the merits of the case, but rather, quote, lacked standing. The plaintiffs did not demonstrate a direct and immediate threat of government-induced censorship. I don't know, actually I just read last night that the Attorney General of Missouri is proceeding. He's quite fierce, so I have to change that. In addition, there's another case that Bobby Kennedy brought in a very similar case. This is called Kennedy v. Biden, and last month, that case was granted standing due to having provided evidence of direct government pressure that will be heard by the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeal this year. So these cases are absolutely proceeding. So don't be too disheartened when we don't get an outright win. They are going forward. The 4th level of this government regulation and legal censorship is incredibly dangerous to a free society. Although it does not impose fines or imprisonment like the next level, to fight back against the 4th level of government regulation takes years of time and effort. It's very expensive, and worst of all, if the courts were honest, they would admit that the damage can never be reversed by the time the case is adjudicated. For example, even if we had won the Murphy v. Missouri at the Supreme Court this past summer, the victory would have been pretty hollow. We all know how different the world might have been if all of our voices could have been heard loudly in 2020. The court can't give that back to us or back to the world. Literally millions of people died due to lack of access to early treatment. Middle-class businesses collapsed. A generation of kids were harmed. The former governor of New York murdered, in my opinion, hundreds of thousands of elderly people. While this 4th stage is terrible and severe, it's still better than the next level, which is the 5th, which is government-enforced censorship, sometimes called hard censorship. This includes actual government punishment, such as fines or imprisonment. I directly experienced this, as did Jordan Peterson in Canada. Both of us were targeted by our state governments over misinformation. I was personally targeted to lose my medical license, and all independent physicians were professionally targeted by their attempts to destroy America's frontline doctors. Whether you joined us or not, we are on the same path, the same mission, and if they're trying to silence a nonprofit dedicated to medical freedom, it threatens all of us. In December of 2021, the California Medical Board sent me a threatening letter threatening my state medical license over misinformation. I brought you the letter. I don't know if you can see it. The reason I brought it is because you can see that they were investigating me for free speech. This was the investigation. December 2021, you're saying things about hydroxychloroquine. 2 critical things. 1, it's speech. 2, it had nothing to do with the patient. It was public remarks that I was saying that people didn't like. This was quite eye-opening for me, that the state medical board is empowered to open up an investigation against you for things that have nothing to do with patient care. I didn't know that, but that is how the law is written. Once they open an investigation for any reason, they can change or expand their reasons or investigations, even though they opened it for free speech, and even though they pretty quickly realized that was totally invalid. They have an open investigation, and they went to town. I mention these things. I'm going to circle back because there are certain narrow policy things that we can try to seek and change in our own states. Was the California Medical Board allowed to initiate an investigation into a physician based upon the words a physician speaks in public? The California Medical Board is legally allowed to regulate physician behavior to protect the public. In other words, it is a little broader than just the patient interaction. If they think you're harming the public, they do have regulatory authority. But it is not empowered to regulate public speech, of course, or private speech. If I was engaged in private speech that was harming a patient, such as imagine a wild scenario where I might have told a patient to take Lipitor, or, to stay inside, Even that doesn't go to the California Medical Board. That becomes a medical malpractice case. When an agency incrementally exceeds the authority it is legally given, it is engaging in incrementalization. Big word, easy to understand, incrementalization. It's expanding, it's taking that power that it doesn't have. That is what the CMB did to me. It designated itself as a government agency that could decide upon the legitimacy of a physician's speech. Again, I use myself as an example. As you know, the most important professional asset physicians have is our state medical license. Preventing state medical boards from tyrannically overreaching their authority was a critical mission for America's frontline doctors. We fought the California Medical Board for 2 years. We spent more than $100,000, and it resulted in a 3-day trial. During the trial, the California Medical Board attacked me relentlessly for 2 things. I'm giving you a lot of detail because I want you to see the limits of what can happen if someone doesn't push back. The first thing they attacked me for were my thoughts, and the second was my presence at the Capitol on J 6th. The CMB said they were investigating me for misinformation related to hydroxychloroquine. You saw the letter. But then they spent their entire trial time and efforts on investigating my thoughts and opinions about J 6. I'll give you examples. And then secondarily questioning my actions on J 6. They never even raised the issue of hydroxychloroquine or ivermectin. Beforehand, for 2 years, as we're in prep, we were trying to prepare for what the CMB was going to do, right? Were they coming after me for this? Were they coming after me for general free speech? I was convicted, I took a plea for a misdemeanor. Were they coming after me for that? Like, what is it they were coming after me for? So we had to prepare 3 different defenses. And defense number 1, which is the hydroxychloroquine speech, they never even brought up. 0 time. What do you think about the fact that the California Medical Board did not ask a single question about hydroxychloroquine or ivermectin, despite the fact that was purportedly why they were investigating me? What do you think about the fact that the California Medical Board did not have a single patient complaint against me? What do you think about the fact that 5 physician colleagues, bless their hearts, showed up as witnesses and said I was one of the best, if not the best, ER doctor they had ever known? Remember that the CMB, by law, is only allowed to regulate physician conduct that could impact the health of Californians. What do you think about the fact that the entire trial was actually a second J6 trial? I was already under the correct jurisdiction of the criminal justice system, including the FBI and the DOJ and the DC Federal District Court. After you consider all that, I ask you again, do we want to live in a society where any state or federal executive branch agency gets to investigate or punish you whether or not they're empowered to do so? Is this part of their regulatory mission, the authority that was granted to them by the executive branch or the legislative branch? The answer is an absolute hard no. So, what brings us to this legal concept called usurpation. When an agency takes power to which it is not entitled, that is called usurpation. I came on this concept, it was in 2020 or 2021, when Kristi Noem, governor of South Dakota, gave a speech. And people asked her, you know, she's getting a lot of attention, a lot of applause. And people said, how come you didn't close your businesses? And what she said was, well, the first thing I did was I looked at the statutes and the laws. Did I, as the governor, have the power to close businesses? And I consulted with all the legal experts, and I did not have that power. So she self-checked and did not engage in usurpation. That is what we want from our elected officials. But now at least you have the language to understand a lot of what's going on around us, incrementalization and usurpation. George Washington said this is one of the biggest threats to our freedom. George Washington, if in the opinion of the people, the distribution or modification of the constitutional powers is wrong, let it be corrected by an amendment in the way the Constitution designates. Let there be no change by usurpation. For though it may in one instance be the instrument of good, it is the customary weapon by which free governments are destroyed. This is no small thing. George Washington was cautioning against unconstitutional grabs of power, even if done with good intentions. He believed that once a government starts to overreach, it sets a dangerous precedent that could ultimately destroy democratic institutions and individual freedoms. I went to trial against the CMB because they were usurping power. Their accusation and their desired punishment to revoke my physician license had nothing to do with their regulatory authority, which was to ensure high-quality medical care for Californians. By their own admission, they attempted to revoke my license based upon words I said publicly. But at trial, they cited no public speech or public words. They provided no evidence of any actual misinformation, which we do all the time. They were wholly disinterested in proving the veracity of their allegation of misinformation. They made no effort to prove I did this thing for which they threatened my license. They announced an investigation of me based on misinformation. And then at trial, they did a bait and switch and tried to say that my actions were, quote, unprofessional, a very broad and vague word, that a physician needs to act professionally. This was their basis. Keeping in mind George Washington's admonition against usurpation, consider the questions that the prosecutor asked me. Consider that a state judge permitted a 3-day trial about my political beliefs and opinions. Consider that the J6 criminal trial judge had already said from the bench that nothing I did that day should impact my licenses. Here are some questions the prosecutor asked me. This was a Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday trial. All of Tuesday was spent on questions like this. Ms. Reed, the prosecutor, do you often post your opinions on Twitter? What Dr. Gold thinks of a criminal prosecution is highly relevant in this case. My question is, do you post frequently on Twitter? Do you post your opinions on social media? Do you recall posting a tweet or a post on social media that said, fraudulent political persecutions of J6 detainees must end? Isn't this bizarre? I mean, I'm not the only one who sees that this is bizarre. My attorney was objecting right and left. This tweet talks about how you reported to prison and your crime was to prevent government corruption and says this is wrong. Do you agree that the sentence that was imposed upon you was wrong? Do you agree with your tweet that the DOJ's practice of overcharging to coerce plea deals is unconstitutional weaponization of government? Now, I just found this fascinating as a doctor lawyer. I'd already gone through the whole criminal trial. We're at a trial solely about my medical license, solely about my ability to practice medicine. And the whole thing was, did I mean these things when I tweeted them? So one of my answers to her was, did you read the 99% of my tweets about medical freedom, or are you just going to read the 6 I wrote about J6? The prosecutor pivoted from misinformation to claiming that I was unprofessional, and she said an unprofessional is a ground for revocation, but her rationale that I'm unprofessional was that I did not take responsibility for being present at J6. This is like quite a contortion she had to do. I had, of course, complied with every punishment the criminal process levied against me. 100% of her questions were about my beliefs about the process with which I had perfectly complied. It could not have been more Orwellian. But I want to empower you with good news. We are not impotent. We do not yet live in China. That effectively fighting back absolutely helps us avert tyranny. When she asked me if I believed the DOJ was weaponized, I said, I had a good time with this one. I would say that based upon this hearing, everyone can draw their own conclusions if the government has been weaponized. You're literally reading tweets as evidence that I may or may not have taken responsibility when I've taken responsibility in court to the judge. The judge has sentenced me. I have complied with everything, and you're submitting as evidence that I'm not complying some kind of group think that you wish I had, and this is your evidence, my words, you'd like to know my political opinions, if it's been weaponized, the facts speak for themselves, right? That was good. I share that with you because it's with all of you in mind that I said this, and I was well prepped by good attorneys, but it was ludicrous. My attorney was hopping down, up and down, objection, 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 and the lawyer and the judge just permitted all of this. It was really distressing. I said, you're asking me about my thoughts. You're not asking me about my actions that show perfect compliance. That's all I have to say. I can't speak to my thoughts. My thoughts are still private. I think when I answered like this, it was all on Zoom and I'm watching the judge intently. I think this was the middle of Tuesday. I think this is when he began to turn. I think he was pretty shocked. You know, everyone, and this is a lesson for all of us, when we're talking to people who believe so differently than we believe, sometimes they're just on a path and they kind of can't get off the path and they can't deviate. They're just walking one foot in front of the other. And then sometimes you can say something that jolts somebody and kind of wakes them up. We're on this crazy path of asking an American citizen who's complied with the criminal process all about her thoughts about the process, and I think even the judge is like just going along with it, and then I'm like, whoa, stop, this is crazy. And I could sort of see his demeanor towards me after that appeared to me to be somewhat different. So, more of that. I had a pretty good time in that afternoon. So at the end of this 3-day trial, I won. And let me rephrase, we won. We won. If targets do not protest an agency incrementally taking additional power to itself, the agency will keep taking more power. This is why I decided to fight back, to protect all of us against agencies taking additional powers that are not granted. They're not going to go up against another doctor for free speech in the way they did against me. And if they do, that doctor has this as precedent. It's already the rule. Precedent in law is king. And in other states, if anybody hears of anybody else going through a free speech challenge to their license, they can go back and reference the California Medical Board case. So we now have precedent that they can't do this kind of thing, that the agency can't. I had already left California. I was rarely even practicing, but I believed I was a worthy opponent to fight the CMB. And in my perspective, I did bring them to heel. It is one of my proudest life accomplishments. But the judge should never have allowed this line of inquiry, which is why we are still proceeding against them in federal court. We're proceeding specifically against the California Medical Board that they should never have brought such a case. So we'll see. This is usurpation, which is that the California Medical Board had no authority over criminal matters unrelated to the practice of medicine. As they were trying to make a square peg fit into a round hole, they could not say a misdemeanor trespass was related to the practice of medicine. Obviously, it's not. And in addition, in their 150-year history, they had never threatened a physician's license with a single nonviolent misdemeanor totally unrelated to the practice of medicine. So the prosecutor contorted herself to say it was unprofessional for a physician to hold certain opinions. The opinion that the DOJ was weaponized should have been deemed unprofessional in her perspective. There could not have been a clearer example for being punished for my words, as my actions were in complete compliance and taking responsibility at all times. The CMB was engaging in this level 5 censorship, government-enforced censorship or hard censorship, which permits legal punishments such as fines or imprisonment and ensures the government controls or monitors public speech, private speech, education, media, etc. Taking away one's livelihood is certainly a huge financial penalty. Other recent examples of hard censorship across the Western world include the United Kingdom and Brazil. There's many, but these are very large ones. The UK, like much of Europe, set itself on a path towards censorship with multiple laws regulating speech. Again, they call it hate speech, over decades, which I mentioned earlier. A British citizen named Jordan Parler had posted social media posting anti-immigration protests. He was recently jailed under the Communications Act of 2003. You may know Brazil attempted to impose a daily fine on its citizens of 50,000 Brazilian reals, which is almost $10,000 a day, for individuals using a VPN to access the social media platform X. Brazil and Elon Musk have been in a tussle, and Musk won't bow to the nation of Brazil. So Brazil was blocking it, and a lot of Brazilians got a VPN, a virtual private network, and the government said, we're going to fine you $10,000 a day if you have a VPN. So VPN usage surged by at least 1,600%, right? And closer to home, you probably have seen the news recently, I think it was just yesterday, where Governor Newsom is trying to outlaw parody speech. This will never work. It's just, I don't know, grandstanding. He has to know that this is never going to work. But the more the ordinary citizens fight back, and the quicker, the better. They tried to do this to us physicians, I'm losing track of time, I think it was 2 years ago, when they tried to pass a bill that we all call the ban the Second Amendment, the Second Opinion law. He tried to create a law, I think it was January 1st, 22 or 23, that said you could only say these approved words, and if you didn't say these approved words in a patient interaction, you could, have your license threatened. So Freedom doctors went up and protested that. It eventually just was allowed to die a slow, a painful death. So we know that Newsom's going to lose this, but what was beautiful about Newsom attempting to outlaw parody speech was that just last night, Babylon Bee came out with this fabulous video completely mocking Newsom and literally daring him challenge. So in other words, one day, we citizens are getting better. One day, We're like, we're not taking it anymore. These fights matter. So if we doctors are part of our national citizenry, so when it hits us in our lane, we have an obligation. I would say Babylon Bee blessedly had an obligation, but I say we had an obligation too, because the California Medical Board is a state agency. What about the restaurateur or the child daycare center? They have a license to protect their livelihood as well. They are less equipped to fight than we are. So this is how the government does it in level 5. The government also targeted all independent physicians by coming after America's frontline doctors. Congress attempted to shut down AFLDS by opening up a congressional inquiry into me on October 21st. 2021 was a super fun year for me, super fabulous. J6, the FBI SWAT team arrest, I was on a no-fly list, Congress came after me, the California Medical Board came after me, it was delightful. But I'm still standing. Now look at this letter paid for by your taxpayers. Congress is investigating me for free speech and prescribing ordinary FDA-approved meds, which of course, you may or may not know, AFLDS never did any medical care, ever. We were public advocacy only, which was a detail that Congress didn't even investigate. They came after America's frontline doctors based solely upon hostile media reporting. Hostile media reporting, primarily The Intercept, which was then picked up by all these other media, was the basis for the congressional inquiry into me. So I submit to you that our Congress, using hostile media, coming after you, this sounds like Russiagate, to silence doctors, is very much in our lane. Censorship is something we doctors absolutely need to be aware of. We can skip the next one. So you can see that physician censorship is very real. The stage 3 institutional censorship is omnipresent, right? Stage 3 is the soft censorship. Hospitals firing doctors who they don't like, get along with. I mean, Mary Talley Bowden comes to mind. Specialty board certifications being revoked. Pierre Corey comes to mind. I gave up my board certification. I simply didn't sit for the exam anymore because I figured they'd come after me anyway. Journals only printing certain information. That's stage 3. I think we all can agree that soft censorship is everywhere. We need to do what we can to get our own independent voices out there in the scientific arena. Now, the stage 4 legal censorship is deployed against dissidents like me, like Tucker, Bobby Kennedy Jr., in a way that threatens all other physicians' freedoms. And stage 5, government-enforced censorship is deployed specifically against the real loudmouths, like me, Dr. Jordan Peterson, Dr. Paul Thomas, Dr. Merrill Nass. And I want to mention one other example, Dr. Eitan Haim, the former surgical resident from Texas Children's Hospital. He was such a threat to the elite that they went right to stage 5, threatening him with prison and financial ruin. He is the whistleblower physician who exposed the ongoing medical mutilation program at Texas Children's Hospital. Despite that institution promising the Attorney General of Paxton they would cease the program. In 1 month, he goes to trial against the federal government. If you're not familiar with that story, America's Frontline Doctors is going to be doing more reporting on it, and his trial starts October 21st. Also, stage 5 censorship is now sweeping many other states, starting in most aggressively in the transgender space. It won't end there. For example, in Colorado, the only substantive conversation a doctor can have with a gender-confused youth is language defined by the government, which is providing hormone therapy and/or surgery. If the physician discusses the biological fact that there are 2 sexes, the doctor can face ethical review by and patient complaints to the Colorado Medical Board, which can lead to license revocation as well as be subject of an anti-discrimination lawsuit. So it's not just your license, you can also be sued as being discriminatory. California, New York, Maine, Washington, Oregon have similar policies to Colorado. It is even worse in Minnesota, courtesy of Tim Waltz, which has the worst environment imaginable for patients and doctors. I said the attack on free speech won't just stop, for example, with COVID and early treatment. Of course not. Many states have passed laws making them sanctuary states or trans refuge states. That's always how they hijack language. This sounds good, like a trans refuge state, which radically destabilizes families. These states, when you read the law, will take custody over minors, including out-of-state minors, and refuse to cooperate with other states' legal action protecting the minor against this, quote, gender-affirming care. All the minor has to have is a tie to the state, and I can tell you what that will be legally. If the kid flees to Minnesota and just, couch surfs with a friend, that's going to be a substantial tie. If one parent takes the child because they're on the gender-affirming care side, and takes away, that's going to count. So it could be a child from Texas. This means that one parent can now abduct a child away from the non-gender affirming parent and go to the trans refuge state without punishment. This is an extraordinary deprivation of parental rights and enormous harm to the child and family. The state Medicaid programs in trans refuge states pay for these mutilation procedures and treatments with taxpayer dollars. The doctors in these states can both lose a medical license and livelihood and be sued for human rights violation. How do you practice in these states? So we can see that many Western nations, including ours, are very far along on the censorship scale. We've all faced levels 1 to 3. Dissidents like me face levels 4 and 5. Let's turn to how and why this is happening. The censorship, which is formally associated with dictatorial governments, exploded across Western nations. Philosophically, there are many macro reasons, ranging from omnipresent allure for tyrants eager to seize power, to our schools and universities voluntarily eliminating young people's most basic familiarity with inalienable human rights enshrined as legal rights in our Constitution, and removal of Western civilization courses from the national curriculum starting around the 1960s. But censorship really took off as a weapon of war against Western citizens around 2014. Prior to that, for many decades, our government did use censorship and propaganda across the world to achieve specific policy goals, foreign policy goals. The cheapest way to overthrow one regime and replace it with the CIA handpicked folks was propaganda. I'm quoting Mike Benz, "The fundamental nature of war has changed. NATO has declared we do not need to win military skirmishes. All you need to do is control the media and the social media ecosystem, because that's what controls elections. And if you get the right administration into power, they control the military. It's infinitely cheaper than conducting a military war to simply conduct an organized political influence operation over social media and legacy media." So NATO went from 70 years of tank building to the explicit capacity building for censoring tweets. So the how is easy. Our military and our government has always had the capacity and proclivity to engage in censorship. From about the 1940s onward, it was useful for us, Americans, to spread propaganda. We encouraged speech. We saturated the CIA narrative across the world. Since the 1940s, free speech has always been supported by our federal government because it has helped local political movements to capacity build to overthrow a particular government. We have supported NGOs worldwide in disseminating political, revolutionary free speech against particular governments. The US has funded many political groups, tens of thousands of people to participate in color revolutions, bypassing the local government. But in 2014, due to a free and robust internet, the CIA started not always winning. Across the world, sometimes populists started winning elections. For example, in Hungary, Viktor Orban. Italy, Matteo Salvini. France, nearly won, Marine Le Pen. In Poland, Andrzej Duda. In the UK, Brexit won, freeing the UK from the EU. Alternative for Germany became an ascendant political party. So USA foreign policy changed from supporting free speech to selectively supporting or censoring speech, depending on which was more favorable for the desired political outcome for that country. So until 2014, we were really exporting our First Amendment. But with the rise of the populist movement in the USA, with the rise of Donald Trump, with the free internet and unfiltered speech, and populists winning elections, censorship suddenly started being deployed domestically against the American people. When Donald Trump was elected, globalists blamed free speech via an unfiltered internet to wins by Donald Trump, Nigel Farage, Brexit, Bolsonaro, Modi in India. Former free speech absolutist, Rick Stengel, the former managing editor of Time magazine, who was a tremendous free speech absolutist, said when he became undersecretary, he argued that not all speech should be protected if it damages social stability. That's an unbelievable change for the former editor of Time. Free speech on the internet had become more powerful than the CIA and the State Department, and that meant that the State Department had lost control of these governments. So our government flipped its foreign policy, and now we lobby foreign governments to pass domestic laws to censor their citizens. We have really become the USSR, spreading tyranny around the world. At home, our leaders are very aware that this must not appear to be like Russia and China and top-down censorship, but must appear to be bottom-up. It has to appear as the, quote, whole of society framework. NATO, State Department, UK Foreign Offices, many stakeholders try to give the impression that the government is not the censor. Instead, the federal government pays stakeholders to do the censorship. The US government has pressured everyone to join the censorship coalition. Universities, NGOs, researchers, media outlets, all funded by the US government. We now have, quote, disinformation labs at 60 universities. My alma mater and Dr. Bhattacharya's has the Stanford International Observatory, which conducts research and analysis on the spread of misinformation, including in the medical and health domains, and works on developing strategies to counteract false information online. So it appears not to be from the government, it appears to be coming from universities and academic centers and media. It appears bottom up. Again, our former Surgeon General created the Surgeon General Advisory on Misinformation. Surgeon General Murthy created the Surgeon General Health Advisory on Misinformation. He wrote a Surgeon General report calling health misinformation as an urgent public health crisis. He leaned hard on social media companies, saying, we're asking social media companies for greater transparency and accountability to monitor misinformation. We're asking them to consistently take action against misinformation super spreaders on their platforms. Followed up by the press secretary saying, we are in regular touch with these social media companies, and we're flagging problematic posts for Facebook that spread disinformation. And I go through I'll spare you, but I go through how they threaten them with the 230, pulling back the 230 protections, which has financially enabled them over legacy media. Many of us have been victims of censorship and propaganda, and we have wondered how it all came about. So aggressively, so widespread, so uniform. It is because the infrastructure or capacity for widespread censorship has been functional and deployed worldwide for many decades, and around 2014, it suited the globalists to turn this weapon against the American people. When free speech started to counter CIA goals, free speech became the target, and the tools to do so had already existed. The White House, Surgeon General's office, Psaki, Bennington, Murthy, Biden, they got Facebook and others to do the government's dirty work because they'd already controlled the flow of multi-billions of dollars in business income to them. So they had the capacity to do it, and then they had the lever of power over these companies because they could withdraw this thing called the Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which has been a financial windfall to the social media companies. So they had the capacity and they had the lever of power. Now, we've all seen the news very recently, over the last couple of months, that Zuckerberg is actually expressing regret for his participation in censorship. Some of you have seen that, right? A little bit. The jury is out as to his final actions, but I will tell you, when you read Murthy v. Biden, Facebook was the only company that did a tiny amount of attempted pushback. Remember, this was before Elon bought Twitter. Mind you, it was tiny, literally an email or two. But to me, this does indicate government censorship does not sit well with Zuckerberg, and perhaps he will act differently going forward. We all notice the censorship because of COVID-19, and then, of course, the 2020 election. These are the two most censored events in history. But the censorship did not stop with COVID-19, and as virtually there was no pushback from these so-called independent companies, the censorship within months escalated from COVID misinformation to other conservative speech, the Hunter Biden laptop, the lab leak, mass vaccines, election integrity, et cetera, et cetera. The trick was to get it all to appear to be bottom up from the people and not top down from the government. That led to organizations like GARM, whom Elon Musk is currently suing, TNI, Trusted News Initiative, and our favorite, No License for Disinformation. Are people in this room familiar with No License for Disinformation? Yeah. Do they post anymore? I haven't, they're finished, right? They did? Okay. Yeah, I know, I was like their favorite person to target. And I haven't seen the same, thank you for that. I was like, I didn't see them. Have I mentioned in my opinion, they went too far with the disinformation board, and I think, of course, that's why Elon Musk bought Twitter. When people criticize Musk, because you sometimes hear that, I caution all of us who want to engage in that to don't have amnesia. Remember what it was like before he bought the platform. GARM stands for the Global Alliance for Responsible Media. It is an initiative launched by a group of global advertisers, media agencies, and technology companies, which aims to basically censor us, and they tried to pull advertising away from Twitter. So Musk went after them as well. So this is always how it is. It's like who's controlling the money, and so they're trying to control them with money, which is pretty foolish to do against the richest man in the world, just saying. The Trusted News Initiative is a collaboration of major news organizations and tech platforms working together to combat misinformation and promote trustworthy news. Scary stuff. You thought all these newspapers might be independent from each other? No, they've all signed this TNI. BBC, Reuters, the AP, Facebook, Meta, Google, Twitter, Microsoft, YouTube. Basically, every big media agency has signed on to comply with TNI. That's why you read the same story. It actually is why when Clyburn's committee came after me and they quoted the Intercept article was picked up by the Washington Post and Time Magazine, NPR, but it was all the exact same. There was no original journalism by these other outlets. So they're all following the same playbook. Now, back to our lane specifically, censorship in American healthcare. The American Medical Association president recently said the AMA is committed to confronting disinformation. We need to address the root of that problem. We must ensure that health professionals spreading disinformation aren't able to use far-reaching platforms benefiting them financially to disseminate dangerous health claims. I just have to stop there. The president of the American Medical Association is saying he's going after not just our speech, but that our speech should be heard, and saying that people who are going to the trouble to do this are benefiting financially. He's not living in the same world we're living in. No dissident doctor benefited financially from taking this course. It's shameful. He says we should act now to prevent the spread of disinformation in the future. Now, the good news is I don't even think the AMA represents 10% of doctors. That's just my opinion. In my father's day, I think it was 60 or 70%. So we've demonstrated that the severity of censorship can be measured along 7 stages, and that we, along with most Western nations, are sliding right into tyranny. We have demonstrated how and why this is happening, and we have overwhelming evidence that it is happening throughout all of our healthcare institutions, from private corporations, such as hospitals, healthcare entities, regulatory agencies, professional societies, and throughout the government, including the Office of the White House, Surgeon General, CDC, NIH, FDA. But we are not here to wring our hands or vent unproductively. All my remarks until this point are so we understand the scope of the problem within the context of our own society, our own government, and our own national history. With that background, let us now turn specifically to the problem of censorship within healthcare generally, within our own medical practices specifically, and the solution. First, we have to acknowledge reality. If you're practicing medicine within the medical industrial complex, know the rules of the MIC game. First, all academic and government institutions and medical journals censor using institutional censorship or soft censorship or corporate gatekeeping. You just have to accept that that's what it is. You might stay in the MIC or not, but that is what it is. Within medicine, most censorship is omission bias and selective reporting, which makes it hard to see. Many issues are omitted and others are selectively emphasized. For example, when you sign up for non-AAPS CME, it seems to be a majority of DEI and transgender subjects. I did it last Christmas time, over Christmas vacation. For fun, I went to the AMA website. I had a really hard time finding basic courses. I'm not exaggerating. It was really difficult. It was DEI, it was gun violence in the home. I'm an ER physician, right? So it was like gun violence was like the most likely thing taking out an ER patient. I mean, it couldn't be further from the truth. It was very difficult to find ordinary courses like on CHF, fractures, asthma, kidney failure, and diabetes. That's literally where it is, so you just have to know that. If you practice within a hospital or healthcare system, you do not have free speech. I think this is a hard thing for people to understand, but you have to absolutely realize that. When your words conflict with the system, you're out. I was an extremely popular and well-respected ER physician for decades, without a hint of a blemish. That all evaporated solely due to my prescribing hydroxychloroquine for a hospital patient. Of course, prior to that, when you look back, I had to follow protocols, government protocols, things that were not great for patients. Sepsis protocols when the person didn't have sepsis. You had to do vaccines, whether the person, everyone who came in with a clean cut got a tetanus shot, a DTP shot. I didn't even think about it. We had to prescribe antibiotics like their water, and we're seeing all the evidence in the last few years about antibiotics and gut health, et cetera. We had to test, you had to do consults. There was a lot of soft censorship there. You can't really deviate when you're in the hospital system, and at least recognize that. Even in your office, if you take insurance, you only have the illusion of free speech. That's a hard one to accept, but insurance companies require you to meet government benchmarks and regulations, follow protocol and checklists. They create financial incentives to favor or disfavor certain decisions, so they also control the amount of time you can afford to actually talk to your patient. You are a cog in a government machine, and the government can deploy you to work for the machine whenever it chooses. We literally saw that in COVID. Now, where are you in your journey away from the MIC? Tens of thousands of doctors would love to escape the MIC, and it seems very difficult. But the MIC is controlling all the big things like hiring and firing, myself, Tally, Dr. Moon, many of us. But it also controls all the small things, the little things, like the EMR, the DEI questions are in your EMR. So you have to decide if you want to be part of the system, if you want to be a cog in this wheel that could eventually be deployed against other people, if that's why you went to medical school. Are you going to exist in a system where you could lose your financial well-being because you tell a patient that there are two sexes, as we have in 5 states right now? So you have to recognize what kind of life you want to live, what kind of person you want to be, that your life is not just your career and your livelihood. I will walk you through my journey away. First, I recognized where I was. I recognized that I had been required to do protocols and things that maybe weren't exactly in the best interest of the patient, but I always thought that I could maneuver the system well enough that I could make it work. But during COVID, I was forced to actually do things that were harmful to patients. That was where I drew my line. So recognize if you've put yourself in a situation where there's a line that you won't cross. I accept that medical journals are full of propaganda. I only glance at journals now just to see what propaganda they're pushing. That's the only reason I look at standard medical journals. I had to find other sources of accurate information, right? We all know Midwestern doctor, he's like my Bible. I don't even know who he is, maybe he's in this room. And others, Dr. Simon Goodek, many others, Dr. Lynn Finn, but you have to find your own sources of information. And then finally for me, I had to leave the MIC. I had faith in my training and my abilities, and I know that half the nation is desperate for non-woke physicians, non-censored physicians. And because I'm a lawyer, I never understood, because I used to compare, why we doctors allowed ourselves to be so abused. So, what can we do? To combat medical censorship in medicine, in my opinion, you absolutely have to leave the MIC. There is no other way. You won't be able to have your cake and eat it too. But we're all in a different place in the journey. I know that the censorship cannot be changed, at least not within my lifetime. There's too much money invested in the other side. There's too much control invested in the other side. However, you can safely in America exit the MIC. You do not have to rebuild the wheel if you want to practice medicine honorably. You also don't have to face widespread punishment and ostracism, financial ruin, or imprisonment. I want to stress this because I think people have more fear than they need to. People look at examples like me and Dr. Hyam and Dr. Nass and Dr. Tally Bowden, and they then become frightened to exit. But as hard as our roads have been, we chose them. We are not examples of what will happen to the average doctor by making an ethical choice. You only have to choose if you want to use your knowledge for good and evil. If you choose to stay in a censorship system, you will eventually allow yourself to be used for evil purposes. But if you reject being a tool for evil, we have the solution for you. I built goldcare.com specifically to ensure free speech between doctor and patient. America's Frontline Doctors is a DBA. Our charity name is actually the Free Speech Foundation. I've always known for decades that the issue has been free speech. So everything I build in my life is towards more free speech. So when I put my attention toward Gold Care, it was to make sure that doctors can talk freely and patients can talk freely back to the doctors. So we are independent doctors and professionals who carefully extricated ourselves from the MIC. We use long-standing and pre-existing American legal structures to accomplish this. Everything about Gold Care is different than the MIC. The doctor and patient have a mutually respectful relationship, mutual responsibilities on both sides. Doctors have been very abused by the system. Because doctors were so abused, they allowed their patients to be abused. It's very clear to me. Doctors and members are part of the same legal family. We are a single community. We have a new medical legal environment with zero tolerance for litigation. Doctors are paid for their expertise and time. That's it. The patient's well-being is the only goal. So naturopathic and allopathic choices are offered side by side. There's no competition. It's up to the patient. Free market consumer choices. Members can access guidance from any expert across the nation. That's new. We've all done that in our personal lives with friends who've called us from other states. We've created the infrastructure to allow our doctors to do that for people across the country. We have a big freedom emphasis, free markets and also freedom pharmacies. It's a huge one. We all know CVS, Target, what they did, to, Walgreens, et cetera. So we emphasize freedom pharmacies. If we don't have those mom and pop freedom pharmacies out there, very little that we can do as physicians. It's very much built for the consumer. It's elegant, it's easy. The consumer always owns their own purchases. We're teaching people a new way to access doctor expertise. We are the solution for independent doctors. Whether you're a solo doctor, small groups starting out mid-career, or close to retirement, I promise you, we have thought about your needs. We have solutions for you. We are not competitive with independent DPC doctors. We are the independent doctors, and we want to come alongside you and make your life easier and better, as well as for your patients. When doctors are well treated, they will treat their patients well. Gold Care sets the patient and the doctor free. So I want to end with that there's good news for each of us personally and for the nation generally. The best antidote to censorship is in-person speech. Thus far in the USA, that is still mostly possible. This is why Tucker Carlson hit the road this entire month, to speak truth directly to people. That is great news for physicians. Unlike virtually every other area of American life which is controlled by censorship, in medicine, as a business, the buyer is seeking this type of in-person speech. The buyer is actually willing to be inconvenienced for this purchase. This is simply not true for other areas of soft censorship. For example, we all know we should avoid the woke stores, but mainly we don't because it's too inconvenient. We know we should avoid the woke banks, but mainly we don't because it's just one more thing to figure out, and so we don't. In medicine, the consumer is personally motivated to make the effort. Wow, how lucky we are to have potential customers who are looking and seeking and wanting to find us. They definitely are there. Because buyers are willing to be inconvenienced to find unbiased sellers. Doctors have an incredible leadership opportunity to combat national censorship. Because it is not yet legal for the government to do widespread government-enforced censorship, there remains a huge opportunity for doctors to build our own free speech systems. Almost all of the punishment that is currently being applied against doctors merely deprives us of government money. It is not depriving us of our livelihoods or our freedom. For the foreseeable future, there is no censorship model we cannot sidestep if we choose. So that is what we chose to do at Gold Care. We know that consumers will come and find us. We are the one large industry, healthcare, medical care, that the consumers will not let inconvenience stop them. And the opportunity is huge. Trust in doctors has plummeted, but at the same time, people will continue to seek doctors' guidance. So what all this means, putting it together, is that American doctors have the best opportunity of all people, both for our own careers, our own aspirations, and to help the nation heal. Because unlike other industries in other countries, consumers, buyers, patients, citizens will seek info from us more than other areas, and there is no widespread censorship past the third level. You can absolutely extricate yourself from the MIC and have a safe financial future. You simply must look in the mirror and decide who you are. You can apply your knowledge ethically, or you can be silent, which is eventually to choose to align yourself with evil. And I just want to say very, very short why AAPS means so much to me personally. So I was a person who never joined any medical organizations, or really any organization, but in 2020 the world was topsy-turvy, and I just was going crazy having to speak out, and I was looking for independent physicians, and by I ended up finding AAPS. I was working at a Native American site just south of Houston, so every month I was flying into Tucson, driving 2 hours south to the Tohono O'odham Nation to do ER work, and AAPS was in Tucson. I was like, wow, this was God, you know, this is unbelievable. So I call up Dr. Jane Orient, and you know, she's never heard of me. I'm like this random human calling her. I'm like, I have to meet with you, I have to meet you, I have to meet. And she did everything possible to not meet with me. I'm busy, I'm da-da-da-da. I'm like, no, I have to meet you, have to meet you, have to meet you. And so graciously, finally, she met with me, and I guess she sussed me up, sized me up. This is way before I became well-known, maybe in May of 2020 or April of 2020. And it's really due to AAPS, Jeremy, and Jane that I had as much support as I did. And so for me, this is a little bit of a full circle moment to come back and to say how much I personally appreciate AAPS and feel that the future of honorable medical care is sitting in this room. Thank you.